The animation of Czechoslovakia has significantly influenced the global animation landscape, with visual creativity and surrealism helping it stand out from the rest of the world. These filmmakers explored the grotesque, the absurd, and the fantastical using various animation techniques, but with a special emphasis on stop motion and puppetry. There's no better place to start than with Jiří Trnka, who is one of the most influential animators to come out of Europe in the 20th century, as well as one of the first to challenge the mainstream Disney style. There wasn't much animation before him in Czechoslovakia, so he's commonly called the father of Czech animation. Starting in the 1940s, Trnka made films with many different methods, including cell and cutout animation, frequently combining these techniques in the same film, but mainly focused on stop-motion animation using puppets he made himself. Trnka was very particular about how his puppets appeared on film. They didn't have changing facial expressions, and instead he used lighting, music, and blocking to establish character. Generally, his films were very light on dialogue, or lacking it entirely, and the soundtracks were mostly narration and music. Trnka's work had many common themes, such as a focus on tradition, history, folklore, and peasants. He made films for both adults and children, but his work was much more mature and adult-focused than you may expect given the use of puppets. Trnka explored many different genres such as Western, sci-fi, fantasy, and horror. He mainly adapted literature, both from foreign writers like Shakespeare and Chekhov, and from Czech authors and folktales. Trnka started his directorial career with traditional animation in the mid-1940s, like the dialogue-free fairy tales Grandpa Planted a Beet and The Animals and the Robbers. After that, Trnka took on the Nazis with Springman and the SS, one of Trnka's few works in black and white. The title character is a superhero that uses springs to gain superhuman jumping abilities. It was mixed media, as it combined traditional animation with photographs. In 1947, Trnka directed his first feature, The Czech Year. With this film, he starts to take on his signature style, and from now on, he mostly creates stop-motion animation using puppets. However, this does include some 2D animation, sometimes even in the same shot as the puppets, and Trnka combined the two throughout his career. The Czech Year portrays life over the course of a year in a village, showcasing traditional customs, and was an international success, even winning an award at the Venice Film Festival. Then in 1953, Trnka released what is usually considered to be his magnum opus, the feature film Old Czech Legends. The mythical epic was his most technically impressive puppet film so far, and the one with the largest scope out of all his filmography, telling the story of the legendary forefather of the Czech people and his successors. Trnka's puppets speak for the first time, but they don't move their lips in sync, and instead speakers are shown from behind. The story is still mostly told through narration and songs. Again, the stop motion shows technical mastery, especially in the complex climactic battle with dozens of puppets fighting with bows, axes, and swords. Trnka adapted Shakespeare for his final feature-length film, A Midsummer Night's Dream. Trnka included none of Shakespeare's dialogue, instead focusing on narration and the visuals to give us a dreamlike adaptation. A Midsummer Night's Dream was very popular at home, and won awards at festivals like Cannes and Venice. From 1962, The Cybernetic Grandma was Trnka's first foray into sci-fi, set in a surreal dystopia, where machines have taken over many aspects of life. The title character is a frightening robotic grandmother that says comforting things, but its behavior is controlling and abusive. Trnka's final and most famous film was The Hand, a dark, subversive analogy for government control over an artist. A sculptor refuses orders from a disembodied hand to create likenesses of it, instead wanting to make flower pots. The hand is seemingly omnipotent, driving home the metaphor for authoritarianism, and forces the sculptor to make the sculptures against his will and watch propaganda before caging him. He's given medals, similar to how Trnka had just been named the national artist by the Czechoslovakian government, despite not being allowed to make an adaptation of Don Quixote years prior. The government banned the film after Trnka's death for 20 years, basically proving Trnka's point. Trnka left a massive influence on the world of animation, and many filmmakers have said they were fans of his, or followed in his footsteps, including not only Czech animators, but filmmakers like Jean Cocteau, the brothers Quay, or Rebecca Sugar. By far the most famous Czech animator internationally is Jan Švankmajer, who followed in Trnka's footsteps. While both employed stop motion, their approaches were quite different. Švankmajer's films were darker and more unsettling, and he was an avowed surrealist. A common theme in his films was inanimate objects coming to life, and he incorporated lots of worn and dilapidated environments and objects. Some of his shorts have no humans whatsoever, and they also sometimes lack narratives or dialogue. Švankmajer's films have a very distinct and recognizable look and feel. They are often highly stylized and dense, with rapid editing and quick shots of unexpected close-ups. His shorts were also sometimes rigorously structured, with an emphasis on cycles and repetition. Švankmajer's early 1965 short, A Game with Stones, had no dialogue or human characters. It demonstrates Švankmajer's affinity for iterative, cyclical structures, as every time a clock strikes 12, stones fall into a bucket and move around in various patterns, forming different shapes and figures. The shapes vary from abstract to resembling humans, and eventually the bucket breaks, ending the cycle. Švankmajer's trademark hyperactive editing is on display here as well. With the flat, Švankmajer moves into the style he's become known for. The Kafkaesque short is entirely built around stop motion that makes household objects come to life and has no dialogue. Objects in a room all turn against a human and make life difficult for him. Then Švankmajer made this similarly themed Picnic with Weissman, where objects again move on their own with stop motion to the detriment of a human being. The objects still fulfill their intended purpose. The phonograph plays a record, a spade digs into the ground, and a chess set plays out a game. No people are seen until the macabre twist ending. From the early 80s, the short dimensions of dialogue was even more typical of the style he's known for, as it's entirely built around stop motion and contains grotesque body horror. This real short also demonstrates Švankmajer's fascination with the 16th century Italian artist Arcimboldo, who painted human faces made up of objects such as fruits and vegetables. In 1988, after 2 decades of filmmaking, Švankmajer finally made Alice, his first feature. Like many surrealists, Švankmajer had an affinity for Lewis Carroll and had already made a short inspired by his poem Jabberwocky. Alice is very unusual stylistically, as what little dialogue there is entirely narrated by Alice with a close-up on her mouth. This happens throughout the entire film, and Švankmajer's use of repetition reminds me of the experimental structural film movement of the 1960s and 70s. Švankmajer's obsession with old, worn objects is on display here, and the house the film takes place in is covered in textured, imperfect surfaces. The rooms look grimy and possibly abandoned, with walls covered in peeling paint. Objects that come alive in Alice include stuffed animals filled with sawdust, skeletons, and socks. Despite excising some iconic elements of the source material, like the Cheshire Cat, Švankmajer's Alice is closer to the spirit of the original than most screen adaptations, as it intentionally abandons logic and is full of impossible spaces. Also in 1988, Švankmajer directed the absurd and grotesque short Manly Games, a darkly humorous satire of media, violence, and masculinity. It depicts a soccer match where players kill each other and get torn apart in a variety of ways. Manly Games combines live action and still photographs with stop-motion animation using cutouts and then clay for the close-ups of the players' heads being destroyed. Švankmajer's 1989 dialogue-free short Darkness, Light, Darkness is also unnerving, with its uncanny depiction of a clay body constructing itself bit by bit. It starts out with just eyeballs, before hands, feet, facial features, and a brain are formed. In his only explicitly political film, The Death of Stalinism in Bohemia, Švankmajer addressed the 1989 fall of communism in Czechoslovakia. It satirizes the history of his home country and features imagery of Soviet leaders. After the early 90s, Švankmajer moved into a phase of his career where he no longer made short films, and his features were, for the most part, live action with animation used extensively and mostly as a special effect. His 1994 feature film Faust updates the German legend of the same name to 90s Prague. The film features lots of puppetry, and as typical for Švankmajer, the puppets are worn and have visible flaws. A good amount of stop motion and claymation are included to show the absurd magical powers of Mephistopheles. Švankmajer's first film of the 21st century was Little Otik, based on a 19th century Czech fairy tale. The feature uses stop motion to animate a freakish tree baby that eats people. Traditional animation is also included, but only to illustrate a storybook version of the original fairy tale. His 2010 film Surviving Life has the most animation out of all his features, as live action is employed for close-ups and cutout animation for wider shots. Švankmajer himself comes on screen at the beginning to state that animation was supposedly just a cost-cutting technique and helped save money on actors. Surviving Life contains many references to Freud and psychoanalysis, which are both popular with surrealists. Filmmakers that have cited Švankmajer as an influence include Guillermo del Toro, Terry Gilliam, and Tim Burton. A major Czech animator influenced by Švankmajer was Jiří Barta, who dabbled in many different styles and tones over the course of his career. Despite the variety in his work, a few trademarks of his style are a focus on the grotesque or bizarre, and making films with minimal dialogue. Also, Barta's work often contained satire and social commentary. Barta made several interesting short films in the late 70s and 80s, such as The Design from 1981, which used paper cutouts to illustrate the creation of a blueprint for an apartment complex and satirize communist architecture. Also from 1981 was The Abstract Hypnotic Disc Jockey, inspired by pop art and optical art. Disc Jockey was traditionally animated, but his next short, The Vanished World of Gloves, was made with stop motion and parodied film history. Barta also made the pagan-themed stop-motion short A Ballad About Green Wood, which features wood moving on its own. 1986 saw the release of The Pied Piper, Barta's first feature film. It's an interpretation of the famous Pied Piper of Hamelin legend from the Middle Ages, and specifically one version of it from a 1915 Czech novel. The Pied Piper has a very unique style, with distorted imagery and visuals reminiscent of German Expressionism, Cubism, and medieval German art. It's commonly compared to Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which also had twisted-looking environments with odd angles. The film uses wood puppets and real rats, both living and taxidermied, adding to the creepiness. Bright colors are avoided for muted gray and brown tones. The film is quite dark tonally, almost a horror movie, and unsparing in its depiction of greed and cruelty. Also, it has no dialogue whatsoever, just an invented gibberish language. Barta's final work of the decade was the bizarre, creepy, and darkly humorous Club of the Laid Off, where mannequins that have been discarded are brought to life with stop motion. They go about their routines in an abandoned warehouse and eat a meal of newspaper and red paint. Their routines are disrupted by new noisy mannequins that have more of a punk rock look. Many see the film as a metaphor for the banal, repetitive existence of the working class. After the fall of communism, Barta had trouble financing his work, and he himself referred to the Club of the Laid Off as his last auteur film. However, Barta has continued to work in the 21st century, including the featured Toys in the Attic, which mainly utilize stop motion, but also hand-drawn animation, live action, and a couple bits of CGI. Often compared to Toy Story, it's about toys that come alive and has a much lighter tone than Barta's earlier work. A major Czech director of the middle of the century was Karel Zeman, who was known for blending live action with animation. His whimsical aesthetic was strongly influenced by silent cinema, especially the film pioneer Georges Méliès, who shared Zeman's love for Jules Verne. Zeman usually tinted his films so the frames were all uniform color, a technique common in the early days of cinema. His films have a steampunk vibe, decades before the term was even coined. Zeman was incredibly creative in his creation of special effects, and the synthesizing of various art forms is stunning and seamless. Zeman's first feature that combined live action and animation was Journey to the Beginning of Time from 1955. A group of boys travel back in time and see prehistoric creatures such as dinosaurs and mammoths realized through stop motion. His next film, Invention for Destruction from 1958, was a huge success and was seen all over the world. It was heavily inspired by Verne's writings and tells the story of a scientist forced to create a futuristic weapon. The visual style is based off the line engravings from the original version of Verne's novels. Other common Jules Verne tropes were included, such as submarines and a volcano. An incredible variety of techniques were implemented, including miniatures, matte paintings, stop motion, and cutout animation. Then he directed the 1961 film The Fabulous Baron Munchausen, which was adapted from an 18th century German novel. The look of the film takes inspiration from the engravings of the 19th century French illustrator Gustave Doré. The movie is about space travel to the moon and includes references to Jules Verne and his novel From the Earth to the Moon. Zeman's film is full of adventure with sword fights and chases, as well as bizarre imagery like the Baron riding a seahorse under the ocean. The film inspired director Terry Gilliam, who made his own version of the novel in 1988. Zeman's next film, A Jester's Tale, is in a similar vein, but set during the 30 Years' War, which took place in the early 17th century. This gives Zeman the opportunity to satirize the military, politics, and religion, as the 30 Years' War pitted Catholics against Protestants. Zeman's 1966 feature film, The Stolen Airship, is loosely based on two Jules Verne novels and tells the story of a group of young boys that hijack an airship, travel to an island, and eventually meet up with Verne's character Captain Nemo. It's in his usual style, but also inspired by the turn-of-the-century art movement Art Nouveau. Then there's yet another Verne adaptation, On the Comet, where a comet collides with the Earth, carrying a section of it off into space. The section happens to be a French colony in northern Africa, and the various nationalities are all stuck together and fight amongst themselves. The fighting is used, as Zeman repeatedly did, to mock the absurdity of war and imperialism. In addition to the petty bickering between ethnicities, the colony even inexplicably gets attacked by dinosaurs created with stop motion, and other monsters like a giant serpent appear as well. The 1968 Soviet invasion took place during production, and the new regime didn't care much for Zeman, so this would be the final live-action film he was allowed to make. Zeman's films were very influential around the world, inspiring not only Jan Švankmajer, but American directors like Tim Burton and Wes Anderson. Another important filmmaker with a unique process, and one that Zeman worked as an assistant for, was Hermína Týrlová, whose very long career lasted from the 20s to the 80s. If Trnka was the father of Czech animation, then Týrlová was its mother. Like Švankmajer, she used everyday objects in dialogue-free stop motion, but in a much more whimsical and pleasant way. Týrlová animated objects like toys and handkerchiefs and soft fuzzy materials like wool and yarn. Her films were much more focused on children than those of Trnka and Švankmajer, but still formally experimental and inventive. She was critical of American animation for its reliance on violent slapstick, and her films were generally much more gentle. Her first film came in 1928, with the silent black and white short Water Lover, which included mermaids and fish. She also directed the animated parts of a post-World War II live-action hybrid that mocked the Nazis, called Revolution in Toyland. A Gestapo officer is made to look foolish when a bunch of toys inexplicably come to life, knock him out and tie him up, and eventually attack him with miniature cannons and bombs. In her 1958 dialogue-free short, The Knot in the Handkerchief, stop motion makes a handkerchief move on its own, and blended with live action, and unlike the later films I'll mention from Týrlová, this has human characters. This short was a huge success for her and set off a new phase of her career. Her playful short Two Balls of Wool is about exactly what you'd expect, and the title characters are anthropomorphized and play music while doing a little dance. Her short A Woolly Tale from 2 years later is along the same lines and features some interesting lighting and wind effects. She brought another simple everyday object to life in her surreal short Blue Apron, which has some frenetic editing and bizarre imagery. In The Snowman, Týrlová brings back the wool characters and creates wool animals like dogs, birds, and penguins. Like Blue Apron and other Týrlová shorts, it is backed by an avant-garde electronic soundtrack. The short even won an award at the Venice Film Festival. Her short Christmas Tree again utilizes wool and centers around an anthropomorphic Christmas tree. In Coral Fairy Tale, Týrlová moves on to fish, who battle each other with pearls fired as projectiles. Another important figure was Gene Deitch, who is actually an American that moved to Prague in 1960. Unlike the others mentioned so far, he worked solely in traditional animation, with no use of live action or stop motion. Deitch's 1961 short Monroe satirizes the military in a story about a 4-year-old who gets drafted, and won the Academy Award for Best Animated Short Film. Deitch also directed 13 shorts with the Hanna-Barbera characters Tom and Jerry, but they are highly controversial among Tom and Jerry fans. They seem to be mostly disliked, partly due to being much crueler than previous Tom and Jerry shorts. Tom constantly gets abused, sometimes by his sadistic owner Clint Clobber, who was an original Gene Deitch creation. The lack of quality may have been due to the fact that Deitch wasn't a fan of the characters, and thought of the cartoons as just mindless violence. Some higher quality cartoons are Deitch's Nudnik series of 12 dialogue-free shorts. The title character is a lovable loser whose life is a never-ending series of disasters. Deitch said this was a way of extending out the typical cartoon logic and physics. The first short was nominated for an Oscar, and the series even got a revival in the 1990s. Deitch was also the director of the unusual curiosity that is the 1967 12-minute adaptation of The Hobbit. This was actually the very first screen adaptation of anything Tolkien wrote, and was made hastily in order to hold on to the rights. Due to the haste, it has extremely limited animation, and is basically just a series of drawings with the camera movement creating motion. It was only shown once just to fulfill the legal requirements, and then hidden from the public for decades. It was thought to be a lost film, but then resurfaced in 2012. Another major creator of Czechoslovakian animation was Brzezislav Pojar. He directed films beginning in the 60s and all the way up to the 21st century, using both 2D and stop-motion animation. Pojar gives us some social commentary in the absurd short E, which attacks monarchy and tyranny. In the film, people squabble over whether a giant letter E is really a giant B. In an Orwellian dig at authoritarianism, a king shows up and confidently but incorrectly declares it a B, and the public is forced to agree by violent cops. Pojar's 1986 short Night Angel was quite different in style from that and used relatively realistic puppets and stop motion, as well as pin-screen animation. The wordless short tells the story of a man who becomes blind and is then visited by an angel. Director Václav Mergel began his career in the 70s and directed a few dark, surreal, dialogue-free sci-fi shorts. Lao Kun tells the story of astronauts encountering amoebas who pretend to be valuable gems with cutout animation. Next, his short Crabs is a creepy allegory where a military scientist creates robot crabs that eat metal and create new robots on their own. Of course, things go wrong when the crabs just keep getting bigger and turn on their creator. His work was often mixed media, like the short Homunculus that combined live action, stop motion, and traditional animation. Mergel's darkly humorous short Microbe was also mixed media, using photographs and 2D animation depicting oddly cute anthropomorphic microbes. One of the most famous animated films to come out of the country was the cult classic Fantastic Planet. It was made by French director René Laloux, who went on to direct more cult animated films like Time Masters and Gandhar. Despite the French director, basically all of the crew members during production were Czech. The sci-fi film is set in the distant future with giant blue-skinned aliens who either keep humans as pets or think of them as vermin to be exterminated. Fantastic Planet is definitely not for children, with its cold depiction of the aliens murdering the humans. It's also trippy and psychedelic, with bizarre aliens, surreal meditation rituals, and a jazz-funk soundtrack. The film in general fits in perfectly with the psychedelic hippie era of the 60s and 70s, and parts of it can definitely be seen as having a drug-related subtext. While the animation is in many cases limited, the designs are undeniably striking and unique. The simple but clearly allegorical story is viewed by many as being about animal rights, presenting the idea that humans may not like being treated that way if the shoe was on the other foot. However, there are certain aspects of the film that make it applicable to civil rights in general, with unmistakable references to slavery and the Holocaust, like humans being gassed to death. The characters aren't well fleshed out, and this is a film more about ideas than individuals. Fantastic Planet had a lengthy production and took 5 years to make, partly because the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in the middle of production. The film was shown in Cannes and won the special prize there. It's also one of the very few animated films to be released as part of the Criterion Collection, and it was picked by Rolling Stone as one of the top 40 science fiction films ever. While the majority of animation came from the Czech side of Czechoslovakia, there were lesser-known but still highly creative animators in Slovakia. The first big name was Viktor Kubal, who is called the father of Slovakian animation. His 1966 short Earth shows us a peasant dealing with urbanization in a flat style with minimalist backgrounds. Kubal's comedic short film Dita at the Front is about a little girl in the middle of a battle, and brimming with absurd rapid-fire gags. Dita manages to end the conflict with silly tricks, like using a magnet to collect all the cannonballs being fired. In 1976, Kubal directed Yurko the Outlaw, which was the first feature-length animation from Slovakia. Impressively, Kubal made almost the entire film himself, but this was made easier by Kubal's way of working that was the complete opposite of perfectionism. He was known for working very fast and changing things up on the fly. Based on a folktale, the title character, a folk hero bandit, robs from the rich and gives to the poor, in a film that mixes several genres and modes, including musical, comedy, and myth. The flowy style of the characters reminded me of another 1970s animated film from Central Europe, and that's Johnny Corncob from Hungarian director Marcel Jankovic. Kubal began the 1980s with his second feature film, The Bloody Lady, which, like a lot of his work, had no dialogue and just a bit of narration at the beginning. The 71-minute-long film was about Elizabeth Bathory, a supposed real-life serial killer from the 1500s and 1600s. The Bloody Lady is violent and a bit disturbing, despite a more innocent-looking aesthetic that Kubal often adopted. The Bloody Lady also changes up its look multiple times, including a section in black and white line drawings and some live-action footage. Also getting her start in the 60s was Slovakian director Jaroslava Havatová. In 1969, she made the colorful and surreal music video titled simply Song, which took inspiration from pop art and psychedelia. In the 1980s, she directed multiple traditionally animated dialogue-free shorts. One example was Contacts, from 1980, told in 3 parts and about normally inanimate objects like matches and pencils. Her 1986 short Restaurant has gibberish in place of dialogue, and surreal touches like a man eating his own tie and women turning into chickens. And finally, Havatova directed Deal, similarly surreal and done in a sketchy style. The 1988 film won the Short Silver Bear Award at the Berlin International Film Festival. Czechoslovakia split into two countries in 1992, but I'd like to mention some interesting animators and films gaining notice since then as well. One of the most internationally famous examples is Michaela Pavlatova, who works in traditional animation. Her dialogue-free short Words, Words, Words was nominated for the Best Animated Short Oscar in 1993. Her career continues into the 21st century with the incredibly absurd and ridiculous short Tram, and the much more serious feature film My Sunny Maud, which got a Golden Globe nomination. Also Oscar-nominated was Daria Koscheva for her 2019 stop-motion short Daughter, which was actually her graduation film. Notably, it simulated a shaky handheld camera, which is quite difficult to pull off in stop motion. In 2023, she directed Elektra, which took advantage of a technique known as pixelation, where actors are positioned frame by frame with stop motion. Jan Ballet has directed 3 features in the 21st century: One Night in One City, Little from the Fish Shop, and A Colorful Dream. Ballet also worked on the Filmforum series of films, which uses puppets and paper cutouts to adapt a series of 20th century Czech fairy tales. Other feature films include the black and white rotoscoped Alwas Nebel from 2011 and The Hussites from 2013, which satirized Czech history. Of course, there were also plenty of animated television shows being made in Czechoslovakia, and one of the most popular was The Little Mole. The title character was created in the 50s in a short film, and the TV series began in the 60s and continued into the 70s and beyond. The series had no dialogue, which helped appeal to an international audience. This, in addition to the big-eyed, cute designs of the characters, made the show quite popular even outside of the Eastern Bloc. The most popular animated series created in the 70s was Pat and Matt, a dialogue-free show about 2 bald men getting into an endless series of disasters around the house. Episodes center around them dealing with some sort of a problem that the duo inevitably make worse through their lack of common sense, yet they always remain cheerful. Pat and Matt has lasted quite a long time, with episodes still being made today, and there was even a theatrical feature film in 2016. Clearly, Czech and Slovak animators have left a huge influence on the world of animation, and provided viewers with incredibly creative works. If you'd like to learn more, I did videos on the Czechoslovakian animation of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and one on Jiří Trnka. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching, and please check out my Patreon, which I will link to in the description.